Imagine a land, vast, untamed, and fiercely contested. A continent where empires clashed, nations rose and fell, and the fate of millions hung in the balance. This was America in the 1700s. Not one nation, but a fractured battleground of kings, colonists, and indigenous peoples. Who truly owned it? The answer is written in blood, treaties, and the relentless march of ambition. To understand the America of the 1700s, we must first erase the borders we know today. There was no United States, not yet. Instead, great European empires carved the land like a feast, each believing it was theirs by divine right or conquest. But beneath their claims lay older truths, the unbroken connection of native nations who had called this land home for millennia. Three powers dominated the struggle: Britain, France, and Spain. Each planted their flags, built their forts, and dreamed of empire. But their hold was fragile, their borders shifting like sand, and between them all, the original inhabitants, watching as their world was rewritten without their consent. Let us begin in the East, where the British colonies clung to the Atlantic coast. By the early 1700s, England had established 13 colonies, from Massachusetts to Georgia. These were not the United States we think of today, but separate entities, each with its own identity, laws, and loyalties. The British Crown saw them as subjects, profitable, yes, but ultimately possessions. Yet even here, ownership was an illusion. Beyond the tidy farms and bustling ports stretched an endless wilderness, territory controlled by powerful native confederacies like the Iroquois and the Cherokee. The British owned this land on paper, but in reality, their control ended where the forests began. And then there were the French. While the British clung to the coast, France claimed the heart of the continent, a vast, sprawling territory they called New France. From the frozen reaches of Canada to the mouth of the Mississippi, their influence stretched like a spider's web, held together by fur traders, Jesuit priests, and alliances with native tribes. Unlike the British, the French did not seek to displace the native peoples. They needed them. The fur trade was the lifeblood of New France, and without their indigenous allies, the French Empire in America would collapse. It was a fragile partnership, one that would soon be tested in fire and blood. But the French and British were not alone. To the south, an older empire watched and waited. Spain, the first European power to stake its claim in America, still held vast territories, from Florida to the deserts of the Southwest. And then there were the Russians, creeping down from Alaska. The stage was set, the players were ready, and soon the continent would burn. War was coming. By the mid-1700s, the fragile balance between empires was crumbling. The land itself seemed to hold its breath as Britain and France, two titans of Europe, prepared for a final, brutal struggle. The prize? Nothing less than the future of North America. But this was not just a European war. For the native nations caught between these empires, this conflict would decide whether they survived or were erased from history. The question of who owned America was about to be answered in blood and ink. The spark? A stretch of land so coveted that both Britain and France were willing to die for it. The Ohio River Valley. To the French, it was the vital link between Canada and Louisiana. To the British, it was the gateway to westward expansion. And to the native tribes who lived there, it was home. In 1754, a young, inexperienced officer named George Washington ambushed a French scouting party near Fort Duquesne. The skirmish was small, but its consequences were enormous. The French retaliated. Washington surrendered, and just like that, the tinder box ignited. What followed was a war unlike any the continent had seen. The French and Indian War, known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, raged from the forests of Pennsylvania to the fortresses of Quebec. Native nations were forced to choose sides, the Iroquois with Britain, the Algonquins with France. But no matter who won, they stood to lose. For years, the French held the advantage. Their native alliances gave them unmatched mobility in the wilderness. But Britain had one weapon France could not match: numbers. Wave after wave of redcoats and colonial militia poured into the fight, and then the tide turned. Under the cover of darkness, British troops scaled the cliffs of Quebec. At dawn, on the plains of Abraham, two generals, Wolfe and Montcalm, met in a battle that would decide the fate of empires. Both men fell. But when the smoke cleared, only one flag still flew. With the stroke of a pen, France surrendered nearly all its North American territory. Britain now stood unchallenged, or so they thought. But in their moment of triumph, they made a fatal mistake. King George III declared the lands west of the Appalachians off-limits to colonists, reserved for native tribes. It was meant to prevent war. Instead, it lit a fire of rebellion in the hearts of settlers who had fought for that very land. The British now owned America, on paper. But ownership without control is an illusion, and soon, new voices would rise to challenge even the mightiest empire. The land had changed hands. But the struggle was far from over. Empires are not lost in a single battle. They crumble slowly, tax by tax, protest by protest, until one day, the unthinkable becomes inevitable. By the 1760s, Britain owned America, but its grip was slipping. The victory over France had come at a terrible cost. Britain's treasury was drained, and Parliament demanded the colonies pay their share. But these were no longer distant subjects. They were Americans, and they would not kneel. Each new tax, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, was met with defiance. In taverns and town squares, a radical idea took hold. What if ownership wasn't decided by kings and crowns? What if it belonged to those who worked the land, who bled for it? Then came the shots heard round the world, April 19, 1775. British regulars clashed with colonial militia. When the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead. Within weeks, the siege of Boston began. Within months, George Washington, that same young officer who'd stumbled into war 20 years earlier, would command an army of rebellion. July 4th, 1776. With these words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident. 13 colonies became something new. Not subjects, not property, a nation, but declarations don't win wars. For 8 brutal years, farmers and shopkeepers fought the greatest military power on earth. They froze at Valley Forge, they starved at Morristown, and in 1781 at Yorktown, they won." When the Redcoats laid down their arms, something unprecedented had happened. A colony had defeated its empire. The land now had new owners, or so they claimed, but the revolutionaries' cry of liberty rang hollow for many. Enslaved Africans, loyalists driven from their homes, and the continent's original inhabitants, who understood a terrible truth: America's new masters would be far hungrier than the old. The British were gone. Now came the reckoning. Freedom has a price, and in the newly declared United States, that price would be paid in land, acre by contested acre. The revolution had ended British rule, but it ignited a new struggle. Who would truly own America now? While politicians in powdered wigs debated constitutions, settlers pushed violently westward. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 had granted the United States all lands east of the Mississippi. But treaties meant nothing to the Shawnee, the Cherokee, the Miami, and dozens of other nations who had lived there for centuries. The new American government faced an impossible contradiction. It had been born from rebellion against oppression, yet its survival depended on taking land by force. Washington called it expansion. The men who did the taking called it progress. To those whose homes were destroyed, it was conquest, plain and simple. The Northwest Indian War raged through the 1790s, a conflict so brutal, entire regiments were wiped out in ambushes among Ohio's old-growth forests. But one pattern never changed. For every native victory, twice as many settlers poured in. And behind them came the surveyors, the deeds, the irreversible facts of fences and plows. When the great war chief Little Turtle finally laid down his weapons, he warned, "You have taken our land, but they will take yours next." He wasn't wrong. The hunger for land was insatiable, and this so-called freedom had another price. By 1800, nearly 1 million enslaved Africans labored in chains across the South, their bodies treated as deeds of property, their sweat making the land valuable. The wealth of the new nation was built on twin thefts, stolen land, and stolen lives. Even the men who wrote "All men are created equal" owned hundreds of slaves. They spoke of liberty while signing removal orders for native tribes. This was the great American hypocrisy, a nation born from rebellion, now building its own empire on oppression. By the turn of the century, the question, who owned America, had an answer. Whoever could take it and hold it by any means necessary. But the story wasn't over. The 19th century would bring new claimants to the land and new reckonings with the blood in its soil. By 1800, America had a name, but it still did not have an end. The land stretched westward, vast and whispering, and a new generation heard it call. They would call this hunger manifest destiny. The nations who stood in their path would call it something else, the end of the world. When Napoleon sold France's last North American claims in 1803, the United States doubled overnight. On paper. In truth, the West belonged to the Lakota, the Comanche, the Nez Perce, horse lords and hunters who had already stopped Spain, outrun France, and defied Britain. Now came their greatest test. What followed wasn't war, it was something darker, a grinding engine of civilization fueled by rifles, smallpox, and broken treaties, the Cherokee Trail of Tears. The Dakota hanged in Minnesota, the bison slaughtered by the millions, not for food, but to starve nations into surrender. At Wounded Knee in 1890, the U.S. cavalry would gun down hundreds of Lakota, mostly women and children, in the snow. The last resistance crushed, the last deed signed, the question of ownership settled in blood and silence. So who owned America in the 1700s? The answer changes depending on when you stop the clock. In 1700, 1,000 nations. By 1800, a fragile new republic built on graves. Today, the inheritors of all that violence and hope, land remembers. In every deed, every border, every forgotten battlefield, the past whispers. Our task isn't just to hear it, but to ask who gets to tell the story next. Thank you for joining me on this journey through America's untold past. The land we walk today carries centuries of stories, some triumphant, others tragic. If you found this exploration as fascinating as I did, consider subscribing to The Past Unfolded for more deep dives into history's forgotten corners. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning,